Hi, everyone, and welcome to Creating the Future's Integrity Conversation for March of 2022. It is delightful to be here with all of you. My apologies to anyone who is not in the US and was not alerted to the fact that we have changed to daylight savings time. So this meeting may be a little bit earlier than you had anticipated, and that includes Carl, whom I unfortunately forgot to tell. And so hopefully he'll slide in as we're moving along here. But it is really wonderful to be with you all. If you are watching this via the live stream at our blog, please put any of your comments, tweet to the hashtag Creating the Future. We will not be looking at the blog. We will not be looking anywhere else but that hashtag on Twitter, Creating the Future. And we promise we will be paying close attention to that this month. Let's start as we always do, just getting to figure out what's going on in each other's lives, catching up a little bit. And as part of that, if you will please let us know where you are, whose traditional lands you are sitting on, and something that has been meaningful and powerful in your life these days. We find it very important to acknowledge whose lands we are sitting on for so many reasons. And for me, one of the biggest reasons is just to acknowledge that we're not the first people to arrive here anywhere. On this planet. We all have a lineage. We all have the shoulders of who came before us. And in some cases, those are wonderful stories. And in some cases, they're horrible stories. And by acknowledging whose lands we are sitting on, we're acknowledging that there was a beautiful, rich history before we came along and stole those lands. So if you will share where you are sitting and something that's meaningful in your life, that would be wonderful. And who would like to start? Dimitri, you want to kick things off? All right, I will mute here.
Hello, everyone. Dimitri Petropoulos in Tucson, Arizona, just one seat over from where Hildy's sitting, the traditional lands of the Tohono O'odham, and many other peoples. These are names we put on them in some cases. And the folks who were here before them, there's lots of evidence of that here. So I honor them as well. The awesomeness that I wanted to share is most of you here know I do a lot of bike riding. And yesterday I rode through the Festival of Books, which is a huge festival that takes place in Tucson. It's one of the largest in the country. And there's just hundreds of authors and booksellers and lots of local people. And it was just nice and awesome to see folks masked up, for the most part, getting together and starting to share something that they haven't done for 2 years. So that's my awesome.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Who wants to go next?
I'll go to say hello, everyone. I'm usually in Omaha, Nebraska, but right now I'm actually on Georgetown's campus. And I just looked up that Georgetown's main campus is on the land that belongs to the Piscataway and Nakachink tribes. I don't know, Justin, you might be able to help me with pronunciation. The awesome is, I guess, that I'm here in Georgetown right now visiting. My daughter got accepted here, and so we're looking around. We're also going to take the train down to Charlottesville to visit UVA, University of Virginia, and also we'll visit George Washington University campus this week. It's good to see everybody.
Awesome. Oh, this is exciting. This is really exciting stuff. Wonderful.
I'll go ahead and follow Angie. So it's as I understand it, it is Piscataway, and the other is Nakachink, are the two. So yes, I'm a couple miles up the road from where Angie is right now. And my name is Justin. And let's see. My awesome is that I signed up for a triathlon, which I used to do over 20 years ago. And now I have 2 set for this year as I come out from some body recovery that I wasn't sure was going to get me there, but it did. And so that's very exciting. Obviously, making my body and mind smile.
That's wonderful. Wonderful, wonderful. Mark, what's going on with you?
Thanks. Mark from outside of New York City, to the right, about 90 miles, 100 miles. It's a rural area that we're trying to keep that way. And we're on the Korchog land, which is part of the Iroquois Nation. And I've said this before, I know, but even as I said it just now, I'm amazed at the people who have arguments about being 12th generation farmers or 7th generation or 15th, or I think I've heard as high as 16, and I'm blown away because they never mentioned how they got the land in the first place. It just strikes me all the time now. It's and it gets worse because we're studying resilience and adaptation and regeneration, and we're looking to the First Nations because they were here for 13,000 years without screwing things up. So now we're looking to them for their help, and it's humbling. Let's just leave it at that. We're going to, as a group, we're going to Scarsdale tomorrow up in Westchester County to look at their food waste system. They've got a residential food waste system that is bringing green to gold, as we're calling it here, is to put the food waste into compost and then get back onto the soils again. So that's the pretty good thing this week.
Oh, wow. Wow. Well, say hello to Scarsdale for me. I grew up like right over the line from Scarsdale a million years ago. One of my awesomes, I will just share, is that Carl is here. So you don't have to go, you can get settled. But I just wanted to share that I am so happy that you're here.
It's good to see you all. And my apologies, everyone, that I'm late. The slightly different time zone here means that we don't always get it right.
Well, you're, like I said, you're my awesome right now. So, Jackie.
Yes, hello everyone. I'm Jackie Bradley. I am on Wyandotte and Anishinaabe lands, also known as Michigan. And my awesome this month is that my organization recently held their strategic planning retreat, and for the very first time used catalytic thinking as the framework for that discussion.
How did it go?
It went very well. I have received nothing but positive feedback saying, wow, this one felt so different. And so people are really excited.
Okay, now that's my awesome.
Sorry, Carl. Sorry to bump
you. You've just been bumped out. It is also really awesome that Farah is here. Farah has joined us once before, and Farah and I met when I was having a conversation with her and a compadre of hers at the Tides Foundation, Luis, and the energy that you have around possibility thinking is just really contagious. So it's wonderful to have you here. If you can tell us a little bit about you, where you are, and what's going on in your life.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. So excited to be here. My name is Farah Mahesri, she, her pronouns. I'm on continuing Ohlone land out here in California, right outside San Francisco. Angie, you're making me feel incredibly nostalgic. I went to GW for my grad program and missed DC. I was out there for almost a decade. And my awesome, and something I've been reflecting on, is just I continue to be blown away by people's generosity and just the number of friends and colleagues over the past couple of weeks who have been, volunteering free labor and love to kind of help me think through some big questions, provide support, advice, and in every moment, just that that recognition that community is so strong and always, and to use that word, resilient. It always kind of meets you where you need help and support. So feeling incredibly grateful for that, and feeling fortunate to be surviving the time change.
Oh, wonderful. Well, it's great having you here. Great having you. Carl, you ready to share something that's going on in your life?
So for everyone who, if you don't know me, I'm out in England, a place called St Albans, just outside London. Well, I know some from a couple of days ago, and I'm going to make Angie feel nostalgic now, I hope, is that I went down to see Beth Breeze, who's an academic that does stuff on philanthropy. She's worked with Angie before, and we had lunch together on Friday. And it's just really nice to actually go out instead of just doing everything sort of online and seeing someone and just being able to discuss ideas and sort of stuff like that. And it was just really, really nice to get out. Yeah, so that will do for me.
That is very awesome. That is very awesome. That mirrors what mine was going to be before it was all of you. I'm Hilda Gottlieb. I am in Tucson, Arizona, next to that guy over there who seems like he's someplace else, but he's not. Which is why we keep switching the sound back and forth so it doesn't echo. Here in Tucson, Arizona, which is the traditional lands of the Tohono and the Pasquayaqui, where the weather is just delightful. So that's part of the awesome. We've been getting out quite a lot, which is just delicious and delightful here. We went to a movie in a movie theater the other day. Very much like you, Carl. We didn't stream it. We didn't close the blinds and sit on the couch. We sat in a movie theater. And it didn't matter what the movie was. It didn't matter. We were in a dark place for an hour and a half, and it was absolutely wonderful. So, yeah, getting back out a little bit. It is an awesome that the numbers are down, that we're feeling a little bit safer to be among other humans so long as they're masked and we're masked. So yeah. Who would have thought that what we are finding awesome these days? 2 years ago, we would have said, oh, I had lunch with a human. Yeah, so if nothing else, this past couple of years has really brought us back to what's important. And that alone is pretty awesome. So, well, let's dive in. Not that isn't diving in. Sometimes the most important thing is that we just spend a little bit of time with each other and get to know each other. Before we dive into today, I want to, pardon me, recap a little bit about where we've been and share some insights that have been occurring to me because I started writing the book on catalytic thinking. And as any of you who are writers know, most of writing happens up here. And then sometimes you pick up a pen or a keyboard, but most of it happens in thinking and rethinking and asking deep questions and several sleepless nights. Which I was fortunate to have a completely sleepless night. I finally took something and fell asleep at 4 a.m. I usually get up at 4:30. So that was last weekend, but it was one of those sleepless nights that was a good sleepless night. So maybe that could be my awesome also, is that my brain just finally started to connect some things, which is really important when you're actually thinking about how do I pull all this together in a logical way that makes sense for a book. And then some things started to become clear about the conversations that we've been having because they're so interrelated. So I wanted to share a little bit about what where my brain went a little bit, and which has to do with where we've been in our conversations here. What became clear early on when we started the conversation about succession planning, which was back in October, so 6-7 months ago, what became clear almost immediately is that this is not about succession planning. Our conversations have become more and more and more about what's next for creating the future, not what's next if Hildy's not here. And so the first thing I want to say is I think we need to stop calling this a succession planning conversation and start really talking about this as what's next for creating the future. What we realized was that the most important question that we could be answering, and the answer to that question was, what did succession planning make possible? And the answer to that very quickly was that the benefit that people receive, they continue to get that benefit. And we defined that benefit as catalytic thinking. We had a whole conversation in January that the most important benefit, the highest potential benefit that people were getting is that framework of catalytic thinking. And over the past several months, we have, in January and in February, we've really been talking about what are the conditions that need to be in place for catalytic thinking to be ubiquitous, for it to be everywhere, for people to be practicing it. So that sort of brings us up to speed of where our conversations have been. One of the other things that's important, though, for the what's next for creating the future conversation is that we always said that creating the future's mission was a 10-year mission. And what we meant by that was not that we're sunsetting in 10 years, but that in 10 years we would pause, we would reflect, we would look at what we learned, we would assess what has changed at that time. And we always said that that was important. Dimitri always used the analogy of the shot clock in basketball. The history of the shot clock is really interesting. You know, you never think about it. You have 24 seconds in professional basketball. I think it's 30 seconds in college basketball, which here in Tucson is really all we care about. Your team can have possession of that ball for only 30 seconds. And then if you don't make a shot, if you don't try for a basket, then the possession of the ball goes to the other team. And I never realized that the reason for that shot clock is because in the olden days, there was no demand that you shoot. And so games would go on for hours because teams would just hold the ball. They would stall. They would just hang on to the ball until they felt absolutely confident that they were standing under the basket and they would shoot it. And I love that analogy because it gives us a defined time frame in which to assess what are we learning, are we taking a pause, are we reflecting, and then are we deciding, okay, what's next? One of the fun things about that is that the clock started January 1 of 2017. I've looked back through so many of our writings and our discussions, which means that January of this year, we are at the halfway point. So the first thing is we need to celebrate that we have 5 years of learning and much to reflect on. We always said that, I love the question, the evaluation question, and we've talked about this as a board for years. How will you know if you're successful? And the answer that we've always given is that we'll know we're successful when people we've never met are asking questions of other people we've never met that bring out the best in that situation, which means that we won't really know. But something will have shifted out in the world, which is our main objective. And so over this past 5 years, our mission has been to experiment with catalytic thinking, to see what happens, and to share what we learn. And one of the things that's become clear in terms of what are we celebrating at this 5-year mark is I don't think we anymore need to experiment a whole lot to prove that catalytic thinking is effective. I mean, Jackie, you just said it now, that it feels better, you're accomplishing different things. We don't have anything to prove anymore. We have experimented, we have learned a lot. And so it is a big time for us to assess what we've learned and to share that. Which is a delightful place to take a deep breath and to pat ourselves on the back and to say, this is pretty awesome. So I'm writing the book and I'm thinking about all of that. And I'm thinking about that whole vision of we'll know we're successful when people we don't know are asking questions of other people we don't know. And here's what happened at about 2 a.m. in that night that I didn't sleep. It was another question, which is this about continuity of the framework of catalytic thinking, or is this about continuity of the questions? And that was, first of all, really big for helping me to write so that I know where I'm focusing on the writing. But when we've always talked about, people we don't know, asking questions of other people that we don't know, we've never said people we don't know are using the framework. We've always said that it is the power of the questions. And so the thought that I had about our conversation today is when we talked about continuity of benefit, we talked about that continuity of benefit as catalytic thinking as a framework. And I'm wondering if what's really important to continue is that people have the questions. The framework is one way of using the questions, but we all know that one question can change everything. And that it doesn't have to be all the questions in the framework. And a framework is a thing that you have to use in the way the framework is. There's something prescriptive about a framework. This is the way you do it. We know that order of those questions is powerful and helpful, which is why things felt different for your group, Jackie, and feels different when people experience catalytic thinking as a framework, but it's only one way of using those questions. And so what I wanted to ask you all is if it's okay if we revisit that question of what is the benefit that really needs to continue. Because if it is the framework, then we've already started to ask the questions about what conditions need to be in place, and we can dive more deeply into those conditions. But if it is about the questions, then there's different conditions for sharing questions than there are for sharing a framework. And so I thought maybe we might start there, if that's okay with you all. Is this about the framework? Is this about, maybe let's just take 10 or 15 minutes. Is this about the power of the catalytic thinking framework, or is this about the power of catalytic questions? Justin.
So I appreciate you framing this, because it was something I know, Hildy, you had talked to some of us in sort of the background from this meeting too, with some of that question. And actually, Jackie, I really love You're Awesome, because I think it gave an example of this, that I do believe it's about, we say change the world by changing the questions, or change the questions, change the world. So I think the thing that we are looking for is a larger number of experiences like Jackie shared, which is something is substantively different and qualitatively better, because they engaged in how they went about it in a different way, asking questions that focused on what better is and what it takes to get to better. Along the way, openly piercing through lots of assumptions that hold us back. But I think, and perhaps that was just a given that we needed to elevate here. But I know for me that just as you said, the framework is just a way to provide really scaffolding for people to hold the space for the inquiry that actually creates beneficial change in the world around them. And that, so if we're talking about continuity, there's continuity of that. That is the thing that needs to be preserved. We need to see people actually being able to do that.
Define the that. When you say to
being
do
able
that.
to engage, being able to engage in a line of inquiry that creates better outcomes for the world around them, and the people around them.
Yeah.
And I would just, realizing that we're sort of stepping back from where we were, for me, there is a strong connection also to the notion of ubiquity. I mean, that it's not just that, Jackie did this, or Justin did this, or Angie did this, but that 10-year mission was about proliferation, distribution, that it was just easily accessible, and more people were able to engage in that activity, inquire in a way that creates better outcomes for the world around them. So I'll just stop there.
Well, one thing that you mentioned, Justin, and I smiled at it for a couple of reasons. You mentioned it almost under your breath. And one of the things that we used to teach in our classes is the stuff that people say under their breath is actually the most direct honesty. And it's, I love her. She's absolutely fabulous. I sometimes can't stand her, but she's fabulous. What I'm really meaning is that other thing. And what you said is that questions pierce through assumptions. And I've been thinking a lot about that. I've been thinking a lot about the fact that when we tell people we need to challenge our assumptions, hey, those are mine, and I'm right. But we can ask a question, and that tacitly challenges assumptions by making me think something different and move to someplace else. So I love the fact that you brought that up. Thank you. What else are you all thinking? Is the important thing that continue the ability to the ubiquitousness and ability to ask different questions? Or is it all the questions all together as a framework? Carl.
So I don't know if this is answering your question or not, but here you go. I listened to a podcast the other day that was talking about open source software, which interested me because it's something that we've talked about a lot in this group, talking about open source as a model. And essentially what this guy was saying was that open source is a model of sort of building software that people like you and I can use is utterly rubbish. It's failed. There is no Linux desktop that we all use. Because, it's really hard and sort of stuff like that. But what he did say is that as the back end, as the operating sort of system, I know that's the wrong expression, but as the back end, as the platform, and maybe framework is the wrong word here, it's been indispensable for the last 20, 30 years, and it's completely changed the internet. So what you're making me sort of think about here with this thing about, is it the framework of the questions? It almost feels like there's a sort of a continuum where framework is more at the end of a product and the thing, and questions are more at the end of philosophy and beliefs and ideas that are then shaping the framework, and then the framework ultimately sort of shapes a sort of a retail sort of offer sort of at the end. So in that sense, I think where we were getting to with questions the other day is that what matters to us as a group, what ultimately has most impact, is trying to sort of be clear about what those beliefs is the wrong word, but ideas and questions that are sort of ultimately shaping sort of how we think. And then the second thing I guess I wanted to say is that, and Angie, this goes to me having lunch with Beth on Friday, is there's lots of conversation going on in the UK at the minute, and possibly in the US, I'm not sure, around tainted donations. Because in the UK, lots of charities and non-profits have accepted money from very, very wealthy Russian oligarchs over the last sort of 20 years. I don't know if any of you know, London has this now pretty bad reputation. They call it the London laundromat for washing dirty money and so on. And some sort of organizations are now sort of saying, oh, well, these people have been removed from our boards and so on. And it comes back to things that we've sort of talked about before. It's all very well having the tools about how to fundraise and like how to get sort of like the best year end. And, you know, I mean, I follow a few American bloggers and they're sending me emails about how do you make sure that your giving can continue and that you'll have a really good year end and so on. But hey, who's asking the questions about, is that right? Should we be taking that money in the first place? What is the best possible outcome that we might achieve if we hadn't have taken that money in the first place? Because no one steps back and asks the questions, because everyone is either firefighting or they're worried about sort of the end of year and so on. So I would still observe the things that we talked about, I think, when I probably very first joined this group, about how giving people the tools and the opportunity and the confidence and so on to stand back and not just sort of go with the flow and to ask questions. That feels important to me, because we're still not getting it right.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'll shut up now.
No, don't ever shut up. It's wonderful. Thank you. Angie, what's occurring to you? Oh, Farah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
You go ahead, Farah.
Sure. I was just going to build, Carl, on what you said. I have worked in the diversity, equity, inclusion space. And I'm also always kind of cognizant of how, especially now, people are like, oh, we want to do JEDI work. So justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion work. And I'm like, that sounds great. For me, justice is more of that kind of framework. It's a philosophical way of approaching issues. And I get into like, what are you doing? And it's the most basic diversity work. They just really they just are like, well, we have to say it's justice focused work now because that's the environment. And so I'm not sure if it's framework or something else, but I think in the same way, I think questions are tools, and there are bad questions out there. There are closed-ended questions out there. There are questions that actually force groups or lead groups to reinforcing assumptions. Not all questions kind of lead to creativity and possibility. And we all like to do the like new trendy thing. So my question, where the curiosity that I'm sitting with, is I agree that having a framework of trying to put out there that there is one way to do something feels limiting and small. And how are we able to kind of make sure that there is fidelity to the philosophy, to the principles, that there are some guiding posts, some, to build on the technology kind of thing, the minimum operating standards, right? Like, how do we help people? And that's not from a compliance or punitive or gatekeeping kind of, but I think there are so many people who are genuinely interested, genuinely curious. And if the only thing out there is like, ask a lot of good questions. Is that enough scaffolding? Is that enough support? Is that enough of a community even to really kind of build people up to do the work they need?
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. I love that expression, fidelity to the principles. Yeah. Angie, what's occurring to you?
Yeah, Farah, I'm glad that you went before me because you said it much better than I could have, but I think you captured really well like my thoughts about like these two things that you want to, I think they're inherently connected. Like we can't really easily separate out the questions or asking the questions with the framework because for the reasons that Farah talked about. And I was thinking also of just the people too there are a group of people who want to do this but are trying to figure out how, but then there's also the group of people who are kind of maybe even resistant to it, but having the framework, it kind of helps lead them to asking the questions. in a way that maybe if you didn't have the framework right, it would be very, very hard or impossible to bring them along.
Yeah, yeah. I'm really getting that sense from what you all are talking about of that continuum, as you called it, Carl. That it's a yes and that it is helpful to think about it as a framework, but it is one way of thinking about it. I can't tell you the number of times we get responses to either a talk or a class or our newsletter, especially, where people say, I tried that question and it was amazing. They don't say, I tried all 7 questions. They say, I tried that question and it was amazing. And so it is, I think there's a yes and there. That and it's different if our reason for being is to help people have questions that are more effective. And oh, by the way, there's a framework that you can fit those all into. You know, here's questions, and here's what it looks like when they're all together. I think there's a big yes and there. Mark, what are you thinking?
I'm thinking I have to make a chart. I've got all these things that we're talking about just now, and it's just they line up, but I don't have the words for them quite yet. I'm seeing the framework as being prescriptive, where I would be in a teaching mode. I'm seeing the questions as being the listening mode, where I am describing something rather than prescribing. I'm going back to the thing about the kernel, the Linux operating system kernel being the framework, where catalytic thinking is the framework. But the questions themselves that make it work for everyone are the application of that framework. And they're not going to be the same for me, for you, for this town, for that town.
Yeah, beautiful.
Something that Farah said that I think circled back that you picked up onto Hildy too, which was the notion of fidelity. And I think that as you think about the whole approach that we engage in, it really is taking a step back of, well, why did that work? And so when we're thinking about fidelity and some of those principles, those are things of, what encourages people to think about aspiration, and abundance and possibility. What is it that encourages people to step aside from their assumptions to answer a question? And I think, to your point, that I would agree from my own experience that you don't need to do the entirety of whatever this is to see the benefit. And when the powerful shift, when you say, rather than why, how would you? Or what, and then even like the next more powerful step, which is not how, but what would it take? But I think the difference there is these are questions that kind of sidetrack the defensive responses, sidetrack, and that's the principle. Like, that's when I think about what we're doing, is we really are talking about holding these spaces where people can engage in real, what I consider honest inquiry. What's really going on? What is it that we really want? Not what has someone told us, not what is it that we are assuming, but what's our ability to have some clarity and allow things to present themselves. So I think, that our ability to frame catalytic thinking, the listening, even the notion of inquiry in that brain orientation, that brain science, that like dispositional, it's about people being able to experience something, and from that experience put forward ideas and tap into creativity. And yeah, I agree that sometimes it can be a single question that totally opens that up, and you've done it. the catalytic listening, if you just tell someone, listen for, aspirations, values, and strengths, I literally just did this with a class and people are like, that was a totally different experience. I was like, yeah, just sit with that and try it. I'm not going to tell you anything else about what comes out of it. Just try it and see what happens and see what's different. So I saw Carl was waving his hand. Sorry, Carl.
No, not at all. I may be making too much of this, but Farah used the word curiosity. And just as you've landed on fidelity and sort of said that's an important word to you, curiosity is really important to me. And the reason is that I sometimes feel that the language about asking questions, it feels a very serious activity. And almost sort of like I have in my mind, this idea of questioning, it almost becomes a sort of a mode whereby we're sort of saying what you're doing is not very good and we're questioning you because we have to improve it. Curiosity is also about questioning, but it signals to me something very, very different that I think is critical to us, because to me it signals something much more about how we've got to sort of just generally ask questions about the world outside that might not be directly related to the sort of the mission that we're currently on or the line that we're currently on. It's about being much more aware of this wondrous world around us. And I know that sounds a bit sort of like woolly, but that it feels really important to me. And we don't use curious as a word very much in this group, so I want to make sure we don't lose it.
Wonderful. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Jackie, what's occurring to you?
I think I'm coming back to Carl's earlier point of it being a spectrum. And I think this pulls in a little bit what Farah was saying as well, in that the framework is helpful, particularly as an entry point. In that if you just give someone the guidance of ask different questions, that can feel very big, that can feel very scary. But if you say, and here's one way that you can do it, that's a way to get into it. That's a way to figure out what this could look like, what this could feel like. And then once you do that and you feel that difference, well, then you can start building on it and doing it yourself and internalizing the philosophy and all of those other pieces. And you can move along that spectrum towards that piece where you don't need that framework any longer.
Yeah, wonderful. Wonderful. It's been interesting experiencing how people come to this, where they enter. And for some people, it is having a framework. And for some people, they completely resist having a framework. They feel like we're selling something. Well, I don't need that because I already do fill in the blank. And for other people, the framework is at the end point. The entry point is a question. I'll use as an example our newsletter, which only ever focuses on a question, where it's bite sizable. It is, oh, I can do that, and to say, and if you add that question to all these other questions, you get this framework. So there's people for whom that framework is absolutely the entry point, and there's people for whom it is absolutely anathema, that they resist it because either they're already doing whatever, or it feels like we're selling a thing. Carl, I think you said a product. And so I really do think, I love that thought of it being a spectrum, a continuum. A question anybody can try, and a framework I need to really, I can't tell you the number of times in classes, in immersion classes, in months-long classes, where we ask, did you practice this past week? And people say, I didn't have any opportunity to practice. Because they see the framework as a thing you use for certain things, rather than, really, are you arguing with your kid? Maybe you could use it for that. But a question they can immediately take and say, oh man, I asked that question to my husband last night. Or So it's really interesting how people attach at different points in terms of a point of entry.
I was also going to say, I think my background is in education, and in education we talk about universal design for learning, which is, again, it asks that question, you know, what is the goal, what is the objective, and then allowing students to have the multiple modalities to get there. So if the thing we're going to do is test for comprehension, allowing students different modalities to say someone is going to actually thrive with testing systems, because that's how that child learns. There's a reward, there's a goal, there's an end post. Some students are going to want to do an oral presentation because they are verbal and they want to do that. Someone might want to write a song. Like, you know, again, the goal is to test for comprehension. And that brings me, Justin, to something that you said that really resonated, which is the holding space. And I know that often is, the phrase itself is used a lot, but there's such a power behind it, right? So this isn't so much about, framework starts to feel limiting, but it's about creating an opportunity for people to have that opportunity to pause, reflect, and say, okay, I'm in this moment, I have a decision to make. Am I going to use something that is transformative, that is catalytic? Am I going to use something that, you know, these other kind of options? And for me, that was really resonating in this, like, there's a container, there's a space. In some instances, maybe the framework, you need something as robust as a framework and a thing. If you're going to the CEO of a company and saying, I'm going to make a pitch that we should do, you know, strategic planning this way versus that way, in that instance, maybe the framework is the way to go. In many other instances, questions might be the way to go. I'm also curious again about what's in between that. Like that, those seem like really big endpoints. And while I always love the small bite size, like, how do I get in there? I'm always curious about what is that? So I've nibbled on something. What does it lead to? And love those opportunities where there is something in between, the like really small that can be like, yes, great, I had a really good conversation that one time, and we're not quite ready to like transform the organization as a whole, but I would love something in between that kind of keeps building. And how are we conceptualizing and kind of just dreaming about that space as well?
Any other thoughts about, because it seems like we're in these sort of yes and, that it is about both.
I think it probably does feel a bit about both, but if I'm going to hold myself to account, I wonder if that's just a way of avoiding the question that you've asked. And I guess then that even if it's about both, we might force ourselves to say, okay, but which is more important? If you have we talked about these before, about even and over statements? Would you prioritize getting the questions right even over having a framework?
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, because one of the thoughts that occurred to me as well, Carl, is, so if this is about being ubiquitous, is it important that the framework be ubiquitous or that the questions be ubiquitous? That people know how to ask questions that bring out possibility rather than react to what is wrong? Or is it more important that they have a 7-question framework? And that do the even over thing again, because I can never remember it.
So the even over statements are where they're useful in non-profit context, because we always want to do everything, don't we? So do you want to raise money, or do you want to not engage with any funders that invest in oil and Russia? So do you prefer not having any money even over taking money from a company that you know is contributing to climate change? But what I was just going to say before you asked me that was that you made me think about this open source sort of software sort of thing again. And and almost sort of answering your question, go right back to Unix. There are lots of different flavors of Unix as an operating system that have come out in Linux. It powers Apple's phones and all that sort of stuff. But there's a set of core principles, that the equivalent of our questions, that are free and shape how people do things. And that's much more important than whatever framework has been developed from that.
Yeah, we might also be stumbling over some definitional things of what we mean by framework versus specific questions. And I guess my attempt to think about that would be, I don't actually care what the words are of a question. Like, the question itself does not matter. But the process and the outcome of that question is what I think is the top priority. So if we're talking about framework as, you know, these are the questions you ask, I would say no. If we're talking about the framework as we ask questions that align with a progression that we might be, you know, that we might believe is a good progression of types of questions, or questions that subscribe to particular principles, then I think a framework, yeah, then yes, it's the framework. It's not the question. The framework is what are the sort of the guiding principles that allow people to understand there is an integrity of process, there is an integrity of intent with the questions, but the actual wording of a question, exactly when you ask the question, I don't think that I'm not bound to that. You know, I run across better questions all the time. And that's just in English. I mean, you know, other cultures and other languages have better ways of asking things that the English language just doesn't do very well. So, I mean, even so in that way, I don't know. Well, I'll just stop there.
Well, and I'm really glad you raised it, because what it comes back to is the way we have been talking about it for the past several months. What we've been talking about is that the benefit that needs to continue is catalytic thinking as a framework. And we have been talking about people need spaces in which to learn the framework. People need teachers who can teach the framework. Spaces where they can practice the framework. If it is about asking powerful questions, I don't need to be taught that. I just need to learn it somehow. I can read a blog post. I can take a click and play class. I can Creating the Future can become a library of resources that people just click, that doesn't have to have humans, a whole lot of humans teaching a whole lot of stuff. That's very, very different than I have to learn a framework and I have to practice how to think in that way. And the path we've been going down is that framework path, that people need to learn it, they need to practice it, they need to, and the question that arose for me at 3 a.m. was, is that really true? Thank you, Nancy. I wish Nancy were here, but is that really true? Which is another powerful question that Nancy loves to ask, is that really true? And what if that's not true? And what does it make possible if that's not true? And so that's what's really been striking me, is that's the path that we've been going down, is people need spaces to learn. We spent the entire last meeting talking about what people need to have. What does it look like to hold space for their learning? I don't need any of that if it's about a question. This week's question is all about what does it take to reach for what's possible rather than reacting to what's wrong. And that's a question. Oh, wow, I'll try that with my kid. So in terms of where we've been going, just in an answer to the when we talk about framework, what are we talking about? The way we've been talking about it is it's a thing people need to learn how to do, and they need teachers to teach them how to do, and spaces where they can come together and practice together, and et cetera. And so in my mind, it is very different if the emphasis is the questions versus the primary emphasis is on a framework.
I think it's a both, having been through this experience, that I needed the space to practice and to be guided. It's like yoga or something. Like you could tell me a yoga pose, and yes, that's good for my body. And if I get it right, it works. But oftentimes I need the bigger context. I need the group. I need the reflect. I need, my body doesn't move that way. Is there a slightly different way to do that? So I think it's a both. I think when we start talking about people learning a behavior, because fundamentally that's what this is, whether it's an internal thinking behavior or it's a way we're engaging and asking questions with other, we're learning a behavior. And my experience is behavior is learned through a whole plethora, but it is a combination of access to the knowledge behind it, but then also the experience, the coaching, the experimentation. So I would say perhaps it is not necessarily so much about teaching of the framework, but for me, it was more about the experience of learning and practicing is what.
But what you
the
were learning and
education
practicing
component.
was a framework. What you were learning and practicing was the framework, because that's what we were teaching.
I know, but I had to be present and practice. That my point is
No, exactly. For learning that, you need to have exactly what we've been talking about this past several months. But if in the even over category, if the most important thing is that, and some of what I keep coming back to is what do we want to be ubiquitous? Do we want people asking questions that bring out the best in each other? Or do we want the framework to be ubiquitous? The series of questions, all of them together. And that really gets back to the even over. "10 years from now, 20 years from now," what's occurring to me as we're talking about it is that ubiquitous in I think about Mothers Against Drunk Driving. 30 years ago, I mean, when I was first starting drinking and first starting driving, it was, just get home safe, honey. Now it is anathema. There was no such thing as a designated driver when I was growing up. It wasn't a thing. And kids growing up right now, even millennials, not even kids growing up now, but kids who are now 40, they grew up in a world where there were designated drivers. That became ubiquitous. It's not because Mothers Against Drunk Driving was selling a thing. It was a thought, and it didn't happen as an upheaval. It just happened slowly and insidiously almost, which is how thinking changes. And and so when it comes to ubiquitous, I think about MAD a lot. I think about the drunk driving thing a lot, because people say it's hard to change culture, and I don't think it is. People say it's hard to change values, and I don't think it is. I think that in part it comes to asking different questions. In Carl's even over, that even over was, it is way, way more important for my kid to come home alive than for me to go out and get drunk and drive. So it's I'm what do we want to be ubiquitous, and what do we want to see the world be different? 10 years, 20 years, we're gone. Creating the future is no longer needed. We're gone. What do we want to see?
So I'm coming back to this idea of the framework, and there's something under that framework, right? There was something of why those specific questions were asked in that specific order. And I'm almost wondering if it's that we're feeling such a strong connection to, whatever those values were, whatever that thought process was that got to that place, if that is really what we're feeling is so important in the framework, rather than these very specific 7 questions asked in this very specific order. And so I'm wondering if that kind of other thing that we're not quite defining might be part of why we're feeling so strongly connected to this framework.
Yeah. It really comes back to that question of what is the most important thing? And is it, as we have said for so many years, that people we don't know are asking powerful questions of other people we don't know?
So I think, oh, go ahead, Carl.
This may be completely unfair and a massive generalization. I think they're asking questions in a challenging way that basically is, you're wrong and you've got to fix it, rather than asking questions that are sort of, this isn't working or you're wrong, and what is a better way of doing it? Does that make sense? I think people are they're very, I don't know, maybe I'm just drawing on my own experience too much. There's this thing about, I'm obsessed, I think, at the minute with this thing about being curious. There's a really important thing about being disruptive, but in a way that's positive. And I think that's what this framework helps us with. Whereas lots of people ask questions in a way that's almost putting the responsibility on someone else to find what the better way of doing things is.
Exactly, and that's the power of the questions. It doesn't require all the questions to have that little bit of a shift. And when I think about it as a framework, as we've been talking about it for the past several months, we've been talking about it as the framework, as that whole series of questions. And it is, Carl, all about questions that bring out, you know, we've always said that these are questions that bring out the best in us. And is it about questions that bring out the best in us? Is it about the catalytic thinking framework? What is the most important thing that become ubiquitous? Because this conversation we're having right here is the crux of the future of creating the future. Yeah.
So the piece that I want to, I think, pull out, Jackie was touching on it. And I think it's a really important semantics. You keep talking the questions and the framework, but the bridge there that is actually the most important thing is the asking of the questions. What I think I've said is, I don't care what the question is, if the asking of the question actually leads to the kinds of things that Carl's talking about, that we're talking about. So I think that when the framework is a tool to help people be able to ask the questions. That's the outcome. They can ask, that's the behavioral piece. And so I think that the questions themselves do not necessarily lead to people asking the questions, and really engaging with them. Just because the question shows up on my screen, what's going to make me then actually ask that question or employ that question or use that question to influence or do, whether it's the strategic planning that Jackie's talking about or reconciling my daughter's messy room, I think that, and to go back to what Jackie was saying, pulling back a little bit, that what we're really talking about is, what does it take to make it possible for people to ask these kinds of questions in a way that is actively shaping their world? And that, I think, is, the question and the framework are just in service to that. And so really, I guess for me, it's thinking, okay, well, then what are the conditions that really support people being able to ask in this way?
So maybe then, so maybe then having a framework is one of the conditions for making the questions ubiquitous.
And again, I'm going to be real particular with language. The asking of the questions is ubiquitous. The questions aren't ubiquitous. The act of asking the questions is what we are after. If that's what I'm feeling like here. And so I'm really, I mean, I am tightly holding.
Okay, but maybe then having a framework is one of the conditions for the asking of the questions.
Yes.
The framework isn't the goal, but the asking of the questions is the goal.
Yes.
Dimitri, you had something, I'm sorry.
One of the
You're muted. I can't hear you. Dimitri, I
Dimitri,
can't
you
hear
muted
you.
yourself.
Start again.
Dimitri and Hildy, we can't hear you, either of you.
It looks fascinating.
Wow, yeah.
And
Redo.
so that's why I said what I said. Sorry. There's levels of assumptions here, and there's a type of question that has within it the answer. So I ask the question a certain way. It's not really honoring and curious and looking for anything other than the answer that's built into the question. And one of the things that always strikes me about these questions is they're very honoring of the people that you're asking the questions of, that you are respectful of their viewpoint, and that is transformational. I mean, it's having a parent who loves you versus having a parent who scolds you. You respond very, very differently. So I think that one of the big powers that's behind, and yes, I know we're talking about the framework, we're talking about the questions, but I'm sort of focusing back on the nature of the questions. And the nature of the questions changes how people respond, as opposed to it just being a question, because we're not expecting a particular answer when we ask that question. We're expecting what you talked about, Carl, curiosity. We're expecting and I can't find another word right now other than honoring of who this person is, who this organization is, who this whatever. And that does address the even over statements, because I'm thinking about it in that context as well. What are these questions designed to do? These questions are designed to elicit a philosophy, a way of being that is very humane and very future looking, versus right now, this is what I'm looking for. So.
Yeah, it is what Jackie was talking about in terms of the principles that are undergirding the questions. The principles are possibility, the principles are compassion, the principles are inclusion. And again, asking one of those questions can just change the course of absolutely everything. And it is the asking of it. Absolutely, Justin, just, having a whole bunch of questions out there. Yeah. But the ongoing reminder and stories of what happens when you ask a question. And you're right, Dimitri, that and Jackie, that those are the principles that are embedded in the questions that are inherent in catalytic thinking. In terms, and I'm just going to keep coming back to the question of, in terms of the the future of what creating the future is about, in whatever form creating the future takes. One of the things that so many of us have been consultants and academics and teachers and leaders at the meta level of the sector, at the bigger level of the sector, rather than an individual thing. And so frequently we talk about the fact that the vision of an organization doesn't change. That what you are hoping to accomplish at the end, 20, 30, 100 millennia from now, doesn't change. But your mission will change a million times, because your mission is about what you do, what you do to get there. I think we're at that juncture. We're at that 5-year mark of our 10 years that says we're going to assess. And one of the things to assess is that we no longer need to experiment. We know that catalytic thinking and these questions are powerful. We have seen evidence. We've got story upon story. We're starting to document all of that. In the what's next, I think this is the most crucial question we can be asking, is in service to what? In service to the questions, or in service to the framework, to catalytic thinking as a thing? Because what we've been talking about, again, for the past several months, is the conditions that would lead to the ubiquitousness of catalytic thinking as a thing. Is that what we want our work to be in service to, whatever that work becomes? Is that what we want our work to be in service to, or do we want our work to be in service to the asking of powerful questions?
I'm still with the camp of we need both.
I think my opinion is fairly strong on this, but I think in response to Angie, what you were saying, I think the framework is the most powerful tool we currently have to help people ask questions in the way that we are aspiring for them to engage in. So I think sort of that reality, just as you were saying, Hildy, the framework is a condition for, and the framework and the education work that we have done to date are two of the most powerful ways we've found to help people be able to ask these questions. So I think
I'm not entirely sure that I agree that the framework itself is the most powerful thing. It is very powerful, and in many circumstances is immensely powerful. The questions embedded in the framework are what make it powerful. It is not having all of these questions in this order. I'm because there's circumstances in which one of those questions is all you need. And so I do think I'm wondering about, okay, let's ask a different question because we're stuck. So let's ask a different question. If the future of creating the future is about encouraging people to ask even a single question in a way that brings out the best in other people, just a single question differently, in a way that brings out the best in any situation. What does that make possible? For whomever is asking that question, wherever they're asking it.
Carl, are you talking? 'Cause I can't hear you.
Oh, I'm just saying to myself, that's a hard question.
You said that under your breath, so it must be true.
Yeah. Well, so I think it could be transformational, right? Depending on what the question is. But then I also, I mean, the next thought I have is like, yeah, that question could be asked whether or not there's creating the future, right? Like what's unique about creating the future's contribution? And it's the framework, but maybe that's my thought.
So if anyone anywhere is asking questions that bring out the best in other people.
That'd be awesome if everybody were doing that. But they could be doing that for a lot of different reasons, inspired by a lot of different organizations or a lot of different movements or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not asking about us. I'm asking about them. It's not about us. If we didn't exist, and people everywhere, if we shuttered today, the questions we have unearthed, and the framework we have created will exist. So if we were to close our doors today and say we're gone, those things exist, and the power of those questions exists. So whether we're here or not, if anybody anywhere is asking questions, a single question that brings out the best in other people, what does that make possible in the world?
You have world peace.
Truly. I mean, it brings about a shift in policy questions at the government level. It brings about a shift in dinner time conversations. What does it make possible if those questions are everywhere? Are the way that we be with each other is those questions. Who might be able to ask those questions?
Anyone?
I mean, to me, it seems like it would democratize kind of all the things that we've been talking about over the past several months. It would mean everyone shares the responsibility for asking and answering those questions. It would mean every space where people gather is potentially a space to be practicing these questions and asking transformative questions and having those kinds of conversations. And so it would be getting at, to me, it seems like a lot of those things we've been talking about of how do we get the reach out? How do we meet people where they're at? How do we engage them in this kind of grassroots kind of way?
And as we're talking about it, and as you've noted, Justin, that the framework is a powerful tool for that. Having the ability to pull all those questions together and say, and look what happens if you ask them all like this. I'm hearkening back right now to a talk I gave 5-7 years ago. I don't know. It was a boards of directors forum in Boston. There were 200-300. It was a capacity building organization that brought together board leaders from all across the region, and 200-300 board leaders. They were primarily board presidents in the room. And I was talking about all of what we're talking about here. Shared the three basic categories of questions about people, about purpose, about resources. And a woman came up to me afterwards and she was sobbing. And I, immediately hugged her and I said, "What?" And she said, "This isn't just about boards. This is about us." And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "This is about parenting." And she just started to sob again. And she said, "And I've been a horrible mother." And I just held her and I said, "What's?" She said, "I'm realizing that I'm asking my kids all of the questions about what's wrong and all of you're going to forget your backpack and you're going to lose your cell phone and that's all I keep focusing on instead of asking them questions about what's possible." That wasn't a framework. That wasn't in anything. That was that question hit home with that mother. And others were thrilled to have a framework that they could use, but I'm really starting to sense that the important thing that needs to continue is encouraging people to, as you said, Justin, ask powerful questions. And the framework is one way of doing that. And if that's the case, then we have some different things to be talking about. Farah, did you have something?
Yeah, and this goes into the category of the yes and not as much into the like, we have to kind of make a decision. But I'm wondering if the other piece of this is though that the community aspect of it. These are not, all of the stories that I've been hearing are not about people just finding this on their own and deploying this on their own, but that sense of interaction, engagement, and is that important? And then that also for me, when you ask the question of like, what happens if we weren't here? And my mind immediately went to, well, the questions that have been put out and the framework or whatever has been put out is fantastic. And what happens as the world changes? How does this thing adapt and move? And that isn't, it's not to say that any one person or entity or group has kind of the ownership of it, but it does take labor to propel things forward. And not from an ownership standpoint, but from a caretaking standpoint, from a pruning away things that don't work. Sorry, really into gardening pandemic hobby, but every now and then you have to prune the thing, you have to fertilize it, you have to help the things grow. Is that a part of the conversation? And if so, how? And how does that factor in? Otherwise, it feels a little, at least again, my initial reaction was kind of like, well, it kind of feels like it's a one and done. And I wonder if that leans too far into kind of almost a perfectionist saviorism kind of thing, right? That here's the thing and it will say, whether it's questions or frameworks or something, as opposed to saying really what it is it's processing, it's slowing down, it's thinking, it's being in community, it's thinking through this together, and the world changes. And then what does that look like?
Right. Yes, very much, very much. I'm drawn back to the Mothers Against Drunk Driving analogy for the caretaking. Yeah, they lobbied like crazy for legislation. But they didn't lobby for my kid to be a designated driver. And my kid didn't become a designated driver because it was against the law. It was now culturally a thing to do. And that was the caretaking of that. And the importance of adapting as life changes, which, you know, the past 2 years going on 3 years has put on steroids. And I'm glad you're gardening.
Something, Farah, as you were talking, that sparked, and it tied to something else I was thinking about. One, which is, I think all of us have a humility around the framework to say, it's not like this is new. It's really a pulling together and articulating in a way that's accessible. So I think in that sense, it almost speaks more to the fact that it's not about the framework because the framework's not new. So it's, you know, people doing this has existed throughout time and history. So it's the strength is not, you know, or the potential role of whatever it is that we're doing is beyond just, you know, naming something that's new and shiny and you know, revolutionary. No, I mean, and I think, Hilda, you even said this. It's like, if you look at the framework and you start looking at other things, you're like, wow, there's a lot of parallels in here. Perhaps this is actually more natural for how we would engage in things. But what you were talking about, Farah, that I thought was important is, and it goes back to Carl's point around curiosity too, which is there something about this driving energy that has to sort of be present for it to thrive and for it to grow, which is, I mean, I equate it to leadership, which is, you know, and one of the core things I think about with leadership is clearly an aspiration for change. It's like, we don't need leadership if we don't want to change something. We just need management for that. But embedded in that, and I don't think I really appreciated this so much until you framed it, Carl, is embedded in that desire for change has to be curiosity. There has to be a willingness to say, the way we are doing it is not the best way for it to be done. I want something different. And I'm looking for a way to help facilitate my ability to facilitate that kind of change that's there. So when you spoke, Farah, about sort of community, I was thinking about, it is about people's relationship to others, their community, their world. And yeah, I think that to some degree, everyone who comes into this circle that's come in contact with creating the future is someone with curiosity and with an inclination to affect change. And I think that may speak, and I know this is sort of further down the road, but again, as we think about the conditions, where are the people who have that? where does that exist? I'm gonna do a Carl, because I just happened to be listening to a podcast this morning. It was Hidden Brain, but the guest was let's see, what was it? Abhijit Banerjee, who is a Nobel Peace Prize. And the whole thing is about how he asked questions. And the premise of all of his research, all of his things, was the simple question, is that true? Or how do we know that's true? And so, and when you said who, Hildy, this was someone who lived on the confluence of impoverished neighborhoods and middle-class neighborhoods, who crossed sort of that spectrum of people experiencing different socioeconomic. And he said, everybody was curious about that question. That question was a ubiquitous question. You could ask anywhere, and it was disruptive everywhere. So again, it just takes me back to who's inclined to ask the questions, and which I think goes back, that's what I pulled out of what you were saying, Farah, which is, you know, who's inclined and wants to, and then what do they need to be able to do it?
Let's go there. Let me scribble it down. If the asking of the questions is ubiquitous, that people are asking the questions that bring out the best in each other and create change, what needs to be in place? What leads to that? What do people need? And let's assume for the moment that it is everything that we've talked about already, that In some cases, they need places to practice together. They need places to learn together. But one of the thoughts that's occurred to me, yeah, Carl, go ahead. I'll save mine.
Mike won't remember this, or he may not remember this. But when we were having the discussion about onboarding, Mark used this phrase about what needs to be in place for onboarding to work. And he used a triptych, 3 words. He said, people need to feel safe, included, and valued. And I loved that. I absolutely loved it. It just really got to the nub of it. And the situation, from what I can see, is no different for asking questions. You've got to feel that you're in an environment where you're safe, so that you're not going to get the chop if you ask the question, that you're included, so that you have the license to ask the question, and then valued, so that someone's actually going to listen to you and not just wait for you to shut up, so that they can move on to what it is that's sort of there next. So in answer to you, there's no point practicing and becoming an expert questioner if your organization doesn't have the environment and the culture where you can ask the question. So we've almost got to think about, our role isn't just about asking better questions, but it's about creating that environment where you can ask better questions and helping people understand. That sounds patronizing, but helping people think through about what's the environment in which questions sort of get asked, helping them think about asking the questions. And then maybe I'm just playing with words here, but we've also got to help people think about, how do you answer them? And I don't mean by that give them the answers, but we also sort of help think about what is it about the way of questioning and that thinking that also applies to the way of thinking about what the answers are.
Part of what's occurring to me in the, you asked who is inclined to ask the questions, Justin. Questions are so embedded in our lives, and we don't even realize it. Grant applications, job applications, planning and budgeting processes, board and staff meetings. I mean, the number of places where, medical people, consultants, teachers, employee reviews, program evaluations. I mean, those are just like formatted questions that we already have like in front of us, not just what I'm asking on a day-to-day basis because Carl and I are having a conversation or Angie and I are having a conversation. There's something about changing those questions as well. Yeah, what else needs to be in place for the questions, the asking of the questions to be ubiquitous? I'll start with the basic, which is people need to know questions that are powerful and why. And I think that gets to the principles underneath it. It's not just, hey, try this question, and this one sucks. It's here's what's going on in your brain. Here's what's going on in Mark loves the math line. Here's what's going on. Are you aiming at the positive? Are you trying to fix a negative? I think that at the very, very basic, people need to know questions that are more effective. And in terms of a language thing, we've found it's not about right questions and wrong questions. It's not good questions and bad questions. It's effective questions and less effective questions. And so in terms of those questions, just know what they are and know why they are. What else? What do people need to have? What do they need to know?
that they're not alone, that there's a community.
Maybe also how it applies to the stuff they're going through in their lives. You know, how does this apply to me as a teacher? How does this apply to me as a parent? And how does this apply to me as an activist, as somebody working in an organization doing planning? Yeah, Justin, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I think this is both internal observation and external observation. So internally, to what you were just saying, Hildy, is I think it has to be people who are inclined for change. I mean, we don't ask these questions if we just want to affirm the status quo. And then I also think for people to be successful or feel confident and comfortable asking the questions. The questions can, I think, be successful in and of their own mind or in their own state. But I think there is something to be said about the askers being comfortable and confident. And this is one of those things, like having to be able to, or being able to pick up on people's desire for change. I mean, I've been in enough instances where I've been asked to fix something, but there is no real desire to change. And when I ask the questions, people are like, I don't want to go there, because that's like, no, that's not what we asked you about. And I'm like, well, actually, if you want to fix, that is what you asked me about. That's the righteousness side of me. But there is something about being able to sense the openness of other people to explore a different reality, that to understand that, at least see, and again, it goes back to what Carl was saying, that at least some curiosity or aspiration for something to be different than what it is.
And what does it take for that to be reality? What needs to be in place for people to be comfortable to explore, or willing to even just put a toe in? Because what we're really talking about is where people are in the continuum of potential. You know, the folks who are not ready are not going to be knocking on our door, whatever we do. They're not going to be picking up a book. They're not going to be anything. They're going to be stuck. Okay. But for those who are either at the, I'll try something. I might try asking a question. Let's start with that, rather than the folks who are diving in saying, oh my gosh, this framework is off and I want to try it with everything. But just somebody who's looking to put a toe in. What would it take for somebody to be willing to put a toe in, to ask something differently somewhere? And maybe that's a piece of it. They try it somewhere where it's comfortable. But what else would it take for people to be comfortable to just put a toe in and ask something differently?
To have examples, to have example questions or examples of, you know, other organizations that have asked similar questions.
Yep. What else? I read an article. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm wondering. I'm wondering if there are. This needs the organizational development people amongst us to answer this. I wonder if across your practice there is almost a core set of common questions that nobody ever asks, because everyone is frightened of feeling too stupid to ask them. So, for example, why do we never openly advertise when we come to recruit our new chair? Why do we always do it just by like tapping a friend on the shoulder? I guess what I'm sort of just trying to say is that I think fear of looking stupid is one of the strong drivers behind why people don't ask the questions. And I think if they had more of a sense that other people don't ask those questions, and it's all the more reason why you should ask them, I wonder if that would be helpful.
Mhm. Sort of name the fear.
A bit like I mean, I'm sure you must have come across this many, many times. Nobody ever asks questions about money at the board. They never ask any questions about the accounts or finance or anything like that. They just leave it to the treasurer or the finance sort of person. And everyone's too embarrassed to admit that basically they don't know their way around a set of accounts. And the regulator in England, albeit quite a long time ago, when we were in the sort of the big crisis, they wrote a list of, here are 14 questions that every board member should ask at some point about finances in their organisation.
Yeah. What else would it take for people to feel comfortable to ask a different question in a different circumstance? And it doesn't have to be organizational, because it's one of the things about catalytic thinking is the power of these questions in everyday life. And just in general, what would people need to have and know in order to have new questions that they could ask? If they are at a place, let's assume that they are at a place where they're willing to give it a try, someplace. What would they need to have?
I'm not going to answer that question, or I don't know the full answer to that question. I just wanted to uplift that I find those to be very different questions. What does someone need to feel comfortable, to me, says incremental, like it needs to be something that is adjacent to something they know, that is tied to something that they know. The question is that what we're trying to do, is to get people like find their comfort spots and like hook them that way? That is, I think that's a model. I think it is a powerful model to ubiquitousness. And is that what we're aiming for? Because the other piece of what do they need in order to ask questions differently, to me says, and they might be uncomfortable doing. They may have questions themselves. And to me, that is much more about what we need for them to have is belief that transformation and systemic change is the way to go. Right? That isn't, to me, it's not as much about the like hooking them by giving them easy things to do and then like pulling them in. It's about hooking someone by giving them the rationale, the story, convincing them that this type of change is what they're actually looking for. And recognizing that everyone has such different learning styles and such different work styles, that for some people, I think the hook is the like, okay, this is small enough, bite-sized enough that I can do it. And then from like a design perspective, I always ask the question of, am I just designing for myself? What am I doing to make sure that I'm designing for people who are different, who are not me? Because it's so easy for me to like be like, this is what I would need. What is it that different users need? How do we employ some of these universal design principles? And I think and then the bias, right, is for me, what gets me to try something is not the comfort. It is the that desire to push beyond boundaries, right? That inherent being like, I cannot possibly sit through another strategic planning exercise that asks the exact same things. I cannot possibly go through another board recruitment thing that just does the same old thing. What I need is something different, something exciting, something intriguing. And that again, for me, is not comfort, right? If it's something that I could probably have puzzled out on my own, if I'm going to try something new, I want it to be new.
The thought that's occurring to me, and I will share with you, Farah, the information on the continuum of potential. It is a deeper dive into the catalytic listening part of the framework that basically acknowledges that everybody is at different stages of being ready to step into their potential. It's about behavioral change. And so some people are at that, I'll dive in. I know this is going to mean that I need to change, not the world around me, but I need to change. And I'm willing to do that because this is awesome and I need to do this. The stage before that is, I'm curious. I'll put a toe in, I'll try. There's a whole bunch of stages, and the important piece of it from a behavioral psychology standpoint is that one needs to go through those stages sequentially. That what they have found, and a lot of the experiments are around addiction and recovery and smoking cessation of if you have not gone through those stages, you'll quit, you'll go right back. One of the language pieces that I love, and then unfortunately we are almost out of time. I need to step into reflection and what's next. Pardon me. Suze Casey is someone who pioneered a system called belief repatterning. She is out of Calgary, Alberta. And Suze talks about 3 stages that I very much appreciate: to see what's possible, to step into what's possible, and to embrace what's possible. So I see it, no, yeah, I'm willing to put a toe in it, I'll step into it, and I'm embracing it. And I just love those 3 words: to see, step into, and embrace. And that question of what does it take for people to see, step into, and embrace, a different way of asking questions. We are at 10 minutes, 8 minutes to the hour. I think this is one of the most important conversations that we could be having in terms of what are we seeing and stepping into and embracing for the future of creating the future. And the acknowledgement that this is no longer about succession planning. This is about what does the next 5 years make possible, and for whom. So if we could all take a deep breath, because this is, and remember to breathe out. In is easy, breathe out. If you took any notes, circle what stood out to you. And if we could just share what is standing out to you as we are leaving our time together today.
Jump in, because something that Farah, you just shared that I really appreciate, that I'm sort of playing in my head, this proximity of practice. Like, I even think about what we just went through. Like, if we're talking about being able to ask these questions, like we took 2 hours to be able to ask the questions in a way that we already know we value and want to ask questions, which I think just demonstrates that space for practice that is, and I like that idea of that sort of is proximal and in parallel to people's lives. Again, it just really resonates for me that one of the things that is a critical condition is this space to practice. Most of us who've done this know that when you do this, you have the potential to open up big things that you may not be even prepared to deal with. And you often run into lots of roadblocks because there's inertia, there's momentum, there's countervailing forces. So even though you're asking the right questions, the environment is antithetical to it. And I think that's why spaces like this, to see it actually work and having people learn it, practice it, again, just the process is critical.
I'm scribbling down everything you said under conditions because they really are. Thank you, Justin. Who else? What is standing out to you from our conversation today?
So Hildy, I really like the expression that Justin just used then about critical success factors, because I think we've talked about that quite a bit today. And I'm sure if we stood back, we could sort of produce a list of them, because what sort of stands out for me is that being able to ask the right questions is of itself not enough. We've very clearly talked about the environment for asking questions today, which I really like. So almost, I think what I'm sort of thinking is that there are intrinsic factors that are about ourselves. So I'm also really stuck with Farah's point about curiosity, because that was really important for me today. But then there are extrinsic factors about the environment for your organization and how you've got to get that right. And then the other thing, just to sort of say, standing back, is that we've had a few good conversations recently, haven't we? As this sort of group of people, and today feels right up there for me in terms of when I sort of think back and some of the really good quality conversations that we've had over the years. This is one of them for me.
Awesome. Thank you, Carl.
I was just going to add, I think, Justin, you had mentioned language, and that was something I had circled in my notes. And now I'm curious to go translate some of these questions into other languages I speak, because I think that there's so much value in just the construction, which led me down to one of the things I've committed to this year is to making sure that I am also pulling from research and philosophy from non-Western, non-individualistic cultures. And so now I'm also curious, Hildy, you brought up kind of research on addiction. And I know there is a counterbalance of research on how people overcome addiction, how people embrace new things from non-individual cultures. What is that hook? What is that thing? And now I'm just like, ooh, I'm going to be doing some Googling tonight, which I'm very excited about.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Who else? What is standing out to y'all? Go, Mark.
I'll give it a shot. I'm stuck with the idea of the toolbox and the tools, and it worked for a while we were talking today, and then it kind of fell apart. But then I realized something I learned from Fritjof Capra was that structure changes within a context, so that the framework that we're talking about may be very different culturally, Farah. For example, it's going to translate differently. It's going to impact people differently. We're going to ask different questions to maybe get the same results. And I think that's what we're seeing in the environmental movement, very much so. We all want the same vision of not just health, but well, WELLTH. And this is why we have African elephants and Asian elephants, because although the framework is exactly the same, they're still elephants. The 5-year-old can say, oh, that's an elephant, but within their structure changed within the context of their environment. I'll keep working on it.
I hope so. I hope so. Angie.
Oh, yeah, so I don't have anything. I have a lot of things floating around in my head, but I guess for better or for worse, I'm still thinking about the people that are not so prone to wanting to ask the questions and how to bring them along. And I guess, yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yep. Thank you. Jackie, how about you?
Yeah, I think I'm thinking about kind of just the flow of the conversation today. I feel like there was a lot of building off of each other's ideas today, because I think where we ended is not necessarily where I thought we were going to when we started, because it really was kind of jumping from person to person and really building and growing. And so I'm just thinking about how that flow kind of felt and how I envisioned that in my head after today's conversation.
Wonderful. And as always, thank you so much for capturing what we do in a way that's English and makes sense. So thank you. Dimitri, how about you?
A couple of things. One, very meta. At the beginning of our session, we talk about the lands that then are occupied by others and were forced off. Right during, I'm thinking about Ukraine and what's happening right now. We just do this all the time as humans. I mean, you know, we pound on others, you know, we make it ours, we do whatever, and not even recognizing. And Mark was talking about, a quick comment about 14,000 years, you know, that humans have been in North America. And there was just a news report recently that it's actually 24,000 years based on footprints that were found in New Mexico that they dated. So I'm just sort of thinking about, we have been around a long time. That's one thought. The other thought is the whole thing about curiosity, and that what I was thinking is that the curiosity allows you to overcome discomfort. You know, that one of the reasons we continue down the same path in whatever we're doing is because it's comfortable. In my own view, there's two ways to move out of that comfort zone. One is something makes it uncomfortable, so you're going to make changes. And the other is, you know, I want to climb that mountain to see what's on top of it. That's not a comfortable thing to do. I mean, you know, that could be a dangerous thing to do. That could be whatever, but I'm really curious about that. So I move forward. So, you know, the curiosity really piqued my thinking here today, and I'm grateful for that.
It piqued your curiosity. I am just feeling immense gratitude and excitement. The biggest aha for me is that we are at this wonderful halfway point. Very, very quickly, Dimitri and I, most of you know, started the first diaper bank. And we were so busy with the doing, so busy with the doing. And when we cut the ribbon on that first diaper bank, we had I mean, this was a tiny little organization. This was just an organization. We had so many members of our local mayor and council here in Tucson that we had to sit them in different corners of the room so that they weren't a quorum. It was this amazingly powerful event that just for the ribbon cutting on a new organization. And it wasn't until, I'm going to say, a year later that the two of us looked at each other and went, wow, we never celebrated. We were so busy in the who's going to sit where, and do we have the ribbon, and do we have the that we never sat down and said, this is freaking awesome. This is just amazing. And all I'm thinking about is, this is amazing. That we no longer need to prove. This is not proof of concept anymore. That we no longer need to say, yes, but try this. And no, we've got stuff that we're going to start documenting. We're going to start that we can say this stuff, you know, as we used to say, this shit works, and it works everywhere. And it's not just organizations, and it's not just interpersonal, it's everything. Maybe it is just interpersonal because everything's interpersonal. And so there's something just really wonderful about taking the moment, breathing it in, and celebrating. And that's what today sort of feels like, is as we start to talk about what's next, this is pretty exciting. So I just want to thank you all, and we'll see you next month. Bye, everyone.
Bye, thank you.